The Night Guard. The same monotonous routine each day, every day, dragging you closer towards insanity. A summation of life in solitary confinement. It's like being buried alive in a concrete tomb, or as some inmates would say, being locked in a gas station bathroom 23 hours a day. I lived that life for 5 excruciatingly long years. Hell on goddamn earth. A violent crime sent me to prison, and an even more egregious act landed me in solitary. An inmate had stolen a bag of coffee from me, worth all of $3. Prison is a different world, with a much more barbaric code of conduct. I had no choice but to assert myself. I confronted the thief a week later, and stabbed him repeatedly with a homemade knife fashioned from a dinner tray. It was a miracle he survived. Even I was thankful for that. As punishment for my act of retribution, 3 years were tacked onto my sentence, and I was placed in indefinite segregation, meaning the administration would only release me once they felt I was no longer a threat to institutional security. Their words, not mine. The prison system was fucked up, but so was I. I'll never forget the first time I walked into the solitary unit. It's a memory I can't seem to escape from. Inmates banging their head against steel doors, hollering at the top of their lungs until their voice grew hoarse. The smell of feces, overpowered only by the scent of despair. And even the guards looked sickly and frail, as if the environment had poisoned them. Shackled in leg irons and handcuffs, and escorted by 2 guards, I was led into cell 13A. It was a barren room with nothing but a concrete bed and a stainless steel toilet. The window was a thin slit of frosted glass, obscuring the outside world from view. As the door slammed behind me, I was left with my thoughts. Nothing more, nothing less. For months, I thought I couldn't be broken, until I was. Isolation wreaks havoc on your mental state. Even the strongest men will crumble. My lowest moment came laying face down in a cell, feces covering the walls, chemical spray burning my eyes, and several officers forcefully restraining me. Around that time, during a sleepless winter night, I saw him for the first time. A majority of the inmates were heavily medicated, sleeping through the night without issue. Now and again, as a small act of defiance, I'd feign taking my prescriptions. This would leave me wide awake, unable to ward off intrusive thoughts and hard questions. Painful, but necessary. At night, the prison assigned a single guard to conduct rounds in solitary every 15 minutes. Guards would often stretch this into an hour, hoping inmates would take the chance to hang themselves. The night shift was only given to veteran employees who had earned a break from the madness. Younger staff weren't gifted that privilege. On this particular night, the guard was not someone I recognized, a highly unusual event that immediately piqued my curiosity. The guard was gangly and tall, well over 6 feet. His clothes were much too small, stretching high above his elbows and knees. Prison was all about order and uniformity, even for the guards. This man was anything but. Firmly pressed against the wall, he stalked through the unit, cloaked in shadow. Meandering about, he eventually headed towards an inmate named Skitz's cell, fingers like branches caressing against the steel bars. I strained my neck to see more, the confines of my cell severely restricting my view. Contorting into an uncomfortable position, I saw the guard bent over, firmly grasping Skitz's outstretched hands. Mournful chanting echoed softly as they swayed back and forth with hypnotic precision. Hours later, the guard stepped back and crept past my periphery. Panic-stricken, I crawled towards the corner of my cell, fearing he'd pass. Some primal instinct was begging me to hide. I was in no position to disagree. For the rest of the night, I hid motionless, praying for the first time in years. Only when the first rays of sunlight splashed through the fogged windows and the breakfast trolley skreeked through the unit did I move. That moment, I ate in silence and watched as paramedics rushed into Skitz's cell. Blood pooled outwards as he was taken away and onto a gurney, limbs dangling loosely to the side. It took the inmate workers, porters, an entire day to clean the mess left behind, their labored grunts a sign of the difficult work. Several days later, I overheard the porters discussing the incident amongst themselves in hushed tones. Apparently Skitz had gone crazy, drawing strange symbols and scenes of death with his own blood, some remarkably detailed. From their telling, every square inch of the cell was covered, even places you'd think were unreachable. Most horrifying, they had discovered his scrotum floating wistfully in the toilet. Skitz had castrated himself. In my cell, I felt like a calf destined for the slaughter. Every day, I'd pace back and forth, replaying the events of that night. Every night, I'd lie awake shaking with fear, peering intently through the darkness. Sleep became increasingly rare, coming for only a few hours in the afternoon. Large bags formed under my eyes, and I became even more sedentary, rarely moving from my bed. On the eve of a large thunderstorm, the night guard returned. Sauntering into the cell block, he strode purposely towards the upper tier. I watched in full view as he ascended the stairs, gliding forward with surprising speed. Each crackle of lightning bathed him in light, if only for a moment. His skin was ashen white, limbs were unnaturally elongated, and his face remained in shadow even when the lightning struck. On the upper tier, he walked back and forth methodically, stopping periodically to peer into a cell. His movements were silent. Not even the slightest patter of feet could be heard. After what felt like a lifetime, he grasped onto the bars of the last cell on the tier, Filthy Frank. Frank was a semi-successful rapper who, after a night of smoking PCP, had stabbed his girlfriend 74 times, believing she was the devil. He even cut out her heart and consumed it. Years later, he would tell a documentary crew it tasted like roasted beets. The next morning, I watched as the officers cut Filthy down from a noose, his body collapsing onto the concrete. Large swaths of skin had been ripped away, muscle and bone clearly visible underneath. The cell was covered in markings, although I was unable to make out the details, and most disturbing of all, the noose coiled around his neck was fashioned from his own intestines. Months went by without a sighting. All the while I waited in fear. I refused to leave my cell, afraid of what I might see. On the rare occasion I was given access to a mirror, I hardly recognized the face staring back at me. A scraggly beard hanging from my gaunt cheeks, lips chapped and bleeding, acne-ridden. These were now my defining features, far from the man I once was. 6 months after Filthy's death, a brutal wave of violence swept through the prison. More inmates were stabbed in a month period than the previous 2 years combined. It was a bloodbath. Despite all the security measures, solitary was not immune to this trend. 7 inmates were viciously attacked in my unit, and unfortunately, one of them passed away. With all other options exhausted, and the prison unable to quell the violence, the warden ordered a lockdown. During a lockdown, movement is heavily restricted, with a majority of inmates confined to a cell 24 hours a day. All privileges are stripped away, most painfully, visits from friends and family. For those of us in solitary, it didn't change much, but for the rest of the prison, life had become drastically worse. A week after the lockdown was instituted, a handful of eerily similar murder-suicides occurred. Several inmates in Cell House B had torn open their cellmates' chest cavities with their bare hands. Teeth marks were found on the lungs and hearts, which had been stuffed back into the victims' anuses. The perpetrators died just as gruesome a death, gouging out their eyes before slowly sawing their throats with a dull blade. After the murders, the news media went into a frenzy. Reporters descended onto the prison from all over the world. A public outcry soon followed, deriding the barbaric treatment of inmates and stark living conditions. With pressure from multiple fronts, prison officials were forced to institute major policy changes. In the wake of these changes, I was released from solitary and allowed to serve the remainder of my sentence in general population. 2,144 days after leaving solitary, my prison sentence ended, a day I thought I'd never live to see. A bright, cheerful sun greeted me as I took my first steps as a free man. It was a moment of cathartic release, slightly diluted from my own melancholy. There's a saying in prison, if you look back, you'll come back. Inmates swear by it. To gaze forward is to accept a new future, to leave the past in the past. Unfortunately, the past still had a hold on me. I looked back. Peering from a guard tower was the night guard, a sight I almost expected. Bathed in sunlight, it was the first time I saw him completely unobscured. His face was a patchwork of decaying skin, all different shades and tones crudely stitched together. Perched on his forehead, a semicircle of eyes blinking at various speeds. Rows of teeth peeked behind thin, black lips, pursed into a smile. I recognized tattoos from some of the murdered men adorning his body, gruesome trophies. With a final wave, his body melted into the shadows and disappeared from sight. Stifling tears, I shuffled towards the awaiting van, ready to take me home. I may have left prison, but it certainly has not left me. Some scars cut too deep to ever heal. Maniac episodes, panic and anxiety attacks, insomnia, depression. These are just a few of the things I carry with me to this day. Worst of all, my dreams are now host to an unwelcome visitor who has made himself quite comfortable, feasting on my fears. You know it's true what they say. Prison does change you.